Neil, Kevin Owen, I'm very pleased to see the face of Marcus Papadopoulos just popped up, publisher and editor of Politics First magazine, as we're taking in the news that this prisoner 2-for-1 exchange has happened. Hi there, Marcus. Nice to see you. How important is this exchange for relations now between Moscow and Kiev? We've been surmising, but no one really quite knows what's going on behind the scenes. We've been surmising it could be seen as a minor breakthrough, if nothing else. What do you think?
Well, I'm going to be very candid, and I don't want to come across as being pessimistic or negative, but there is very, very little significance on this development for relations between Russia and Ukraine. On a personal level, there is significance. The two Russians who have returned to Russia today have family in Russia, and the families will be delighted to have their beloved relatives back in Russia. But if we're talking about politically, if we're talking about in the long term, this is not going to have any effect whatsoever. How do you diffuse the crisis in Ukraine? Well, the West, led by America, has to renounce its plans of trying to bring Ukraine into the West's orbit, and in particular of trying to bring Ukraine into NATO. A Ukraine in NATO would pose a very, very serious threat to Russia's national security. And on that basis, that is the crux of the crisis in Ukraine. The crisis in Ukraine has been caused by the West in the long term and in the short term by trying to bring Ukraine into the West's orbit. So regrettably, the developments today do not have any significance when we're talking about politics.
Savchenko's arrest back then generated a lot of media interest, well, obviously within Ukraine, but how was it covered where you are, in Britain there, for instance?
Well, British media and, of course, British politicians, they're following a very similar line to how Ukrainian journalists and how Ukrainian politicians are portraying this. On the one hand, we see in Britain quite a few references to how Savchenko is, of course, a female, and secondly, how her arrest and imprisonment, despite the fact she was found guilty of having directed artillery fire at two Russian journalists, which resulted in their deaths, but despite that, she's portrayed in Britain as representing Ukraine's independence, as being a heroine for the Ukrainian nation. Now, of course, anyone who understands the history of Ukraine will know that that is absolute nonsense. Ukraine is an artificially created country. Its borders are 100% artificial. They were added to by the Tsars and then the Bolsheviks. And of course, there is no such thing as a Ukrainian nation. Ever since Ukraine became independent, which took the whole of the population of Ukraine by surprise and was not what they wanted, we have seen nationalists in Ukraine, backed by the West, falsify history, rewrite history, to present Ukraine as being distinct, to present Ukraine as having nothing to do with Russia. Well, of course, a visit to Odessa, a visit to Kharkov, or Kherson, or Dnipropetrovsk would dispel that.
Marcus, Ewan O'Neill here in the studio, joining with Kevin Owen as well. Savchenko has become a hero in Ukraine. The Ukrainian president, in fact, awarded her the country's highest military honour. In such a tender time between relations, do you think that that was appropriate?
No, I don't think it was appropriate. But what we have to remember is that there are two wars being fought at the moment. A war in the east of the country, in the Donbass, but also a PR war. Now, Poroshenko, who is desperately trying to take Ukraine into the West's orbit, into the European Union, and ultimately into NATO, needs to portray Russia as this external threat, as this hostile country. And he needs to find people like Savchenko. And because she's a woman, it serves his case even more so. So for him, Savchenko fit the bill. She was a female, she's a Ukrainian nationalist, and she was fighting in the east and or he's able to turn that into a story whereby small, innocent Ukraine is being threatened by, quote, the Russian bear. That is what the West, that is how the West is portraying Savchenko. That is how the West is advising Poroshenko to portray this situation.
Do you think now that that's what we're going to see, an idol made of her by Poroshenko in the country to say, this is the diplomatic coup that I have carried out. I sent my president plane to Russia. I got out a person who has been given the highest honours in Ukraine? Or the flip side of that, could he see this as a sign of underneath diplomacy between the two countries to say, OK, we did this is what happens when war occurs. We've got our soldier back. Russia has got 2 of their citizens back now. Let's just draw a line under this.
Well, I think that it's fair to say that Poroshenko is a politician that the Russian government can talk with. There's not many other Ukrainian politicians at present in Kiev who the Russians can talk with. So certainly I think Poroshenko privately in his dealings with the Russians will try to use this as a way of saying that I'm still open to negotiation. But of course, Savchenko is going to be, there's political gain with her. And as I said earlier, if we're talking about the long-term situation regarding the crisis in Ukraine, this is not going to change anything whatsoever. The way you diffuse the tension over Ukraine is for Ukraine to be a non-aligned country whereby it is not in the West's orbit, and is certainly not in NATO.
The thoughts of Marcus Papadopoulos, publisher and editor of Politics First. Thanks for sharing your thoughts and taking the time to speak to us here on RT International, Marcus, this hour. I'm joined by